the longest time, say at least in the 20th century, it was presumed that we make a pretty complete model of the world, and then we act in the world and we compare what happens to that model, and as long as our model and the world are matching, then roughly speaking we believe that everything is okay and our emotions stay under control. But if that model mismatches, then we know that something's up. Now, a lot of this work was done by Russians, especially in the early 60s, by two Russian scientists, Vinogradova and Sokolove, who were students of Alexander Luria, who was arguably the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. Luria spent a lot of time studying soldiers from World War II that had received head injuries and of various sorts, and because of that he could draw inferences about how the brain worked, and some of what we're going to talk about over the upcoming weeks with regards to brain function, much of it is predicated on Luria's work. And Sokolov and Vinogradova were his students, and they were interested in this phenomena. They were interested in psychophysiological measurement, right? So as a way of inferring brain function. And so psychophysiological measurement is measurement of those physiological parameters, say like pupil width or skin conductance or EEG, that are in some ways directly reflective of how the brain works. Now, if you measure skin resistance changes with the amount that you sweat, and that can change very, very rapidly, and it changes in response to physiological demands placed on your body. So for example, if your body assumes that you're going to leap into action for some purpose, then it's going to open up your pores to prepare you to keep yourself cool, and you can measure those transformations quite accurately by measuring the electrical resistance of the skin. And so what you see, if you put someone in a lab chair and you expose themselves to different stimuli, you find that, for example, if you expose them to something that's threatening, say like a picture of a snake, then their skin conductance will decrease because their skin conductance will increase because they sweat a little bit more, and it's quite a rapid response. It can be a very rapid response. Now, one of the things that Sokolov, or yeah, that's right, noted was that if I sat you down, for example, and I put some headphones on you and I played a tone to you that repeated, just exactly the same tone that repeated at predictable intervals, that the first time you heard the tone you'd produce quite a spike in skin conductance, and the next time a slightly smaller spike, and then the next time a slightly smaller spike, until after maybe you'd heard it 3 or 4 times you would not respond to it at all. And that was often regarded as habituation. And habituation is the same thing that you can see in snails, for example, and I'm using snails as an example because they have very, very simple nervous systems. So if you take a snail and you poke it, then like it comes out of its shell, and you poke it, it'll go back into its shell, and then it'll come out. Then if you poke it again, it'll go back into its shell and it'll come out. But if you keep doing that, sooner or later the snail will just stop going in. And you might think of that, it has been conceptualized as the simplest form of learning, habituation. And the behaviorists tended to presume that if a human being manifested a response that could be modeled by a simple organism, then the human being was using a response that was analogous to that of the simple organism. And sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. So for example, you have simple reflexes that, you know, if you put your hand on a hot stove you'll jerk back, and that's quite a simple circuit. You move your hand back before the message gets to your brain, because the spinal cord is smart enough to mediate reflex like that all by itself. So, you know, your brain is actually quite distributed throughout your body. It's not just in your head like people tend to think. And so we have conserved fast acting reflexes at various levels of our nervous system. They aren't capable of sophisticated response. It's pretty much stimulus response, thinking about it from the behavioral perspective, but they have as an advantage incredible speed because there just aren't that many neural connections between the stimulus and the response. And so we have layers of response at different time frames that help us match with the demands of of the external environment. So Charles Darwin, for example, used to go into the, I think it was museum in England, I don't remember the name of it. They had a snake in there, I believe it was a cobra, and he'd stick his face up at the glass and the cobra would strike at him and he'd jerk back, and he tried many times to master that reflexive response to the snake, but there was no way. Every time that thing struck at him, he jumped backwards. Well, you can imagine the survival utility in a reflex like that, but in reflexes in general. Okay, so back to Sokolove. Now, what he decided, thought, if you took that tone and you did anything to it that was perceptible, right, because there are certain gradations of tone that you're not capable of perceiving, but let's assume you took the tone and you adjusted it enough so that it was perceptibly louder, or it was perceptibly a different frequency or something like that, or even that the spaces between the tones, because I said they were predictably spaced, even though if the spaces between the tones were changed, then when the change occurred, the orienting reflex would be reinstated. You'd respond to it again. And Sokolove tried to vary the tone on many parameters, but no matter what parameter he varied it on, as long as you could detect it perceptibly, you'd produce an orienting reflex. So Sokolove's idea was that you must be producing a complex internal model of the world that's in concordance with the world across pretty much every perceptible dimension, because if you weren't doing that, how in the world would you know that the tone had changed from what you had already learned about it? And so for the longest time, and this was also true for people who were investigating artificial intelligence, we had this idea that what people did was make a complex model of the world and hold it in their mind, so to speak, and then they'd act in the world and they'd compare what they expected to happen in the world with the model, and as long as there was a match, then there was no orienting reflex. Now the orienting reflex turns out to be quite a complex reflex. It's not merely an alteration in skin conductance. What it is in essence is the manner in which you start to unfold your response to the unknown, and the initial stages of that are very quick, but it's hard to tell when the orienting reflex stops and when more complex learning begins. They sort of shade into one another. So the initial stages of the orienting reflex are quite reflexive. You must be producing a complex internal model of the world that's in concordance with the world across pretty much every perceptible dimension, because if you weren't doing that, how in the world would you know that the tone had changed from what you had already learned about it? And so for the longest time, and this was also true for people who were investigating artificial intelligence, we had this idea that what people did was make a complex model of the world and hold it in their mind, so to speak, and then they'd act in the world and they'd compare what they expected to happen in the world with the model, and as long as there was a match, then there was no orienting reflex. Now the orienting reflex turns out to be quite a complex reflex. It's not merely an alteration in skin conductance. What it is in essence is the manner in which you start to unfold your response to the unknown, and the initial stages of that are very quick, but it's hard to tell when the orienting reflex stops and when more complex learning begins. They sort of shade into one another. So the initial stages of the orienting reflex are quite reflexive, but the later stages can be extraordinarily complex. So for example, well, I always think the example of betrayal is the best one because it's so complex. So imagine that, you know, you come home and you find evidence, lipstick or something like that, evidence that the person that you're with is betraying you. The first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to orient. There's going to be a real shock, and that's reflexive. It's very much akin to the response that you would manifest if you saw a predator or snake or something like that. And so that's very instantaneous, you know, and then that'll prepare you for action. You'll get ready to do whatever it is that you need to do next. That'll be a very unpleasant thing, but then it might take you even years to fully manifest the learning that would be necessary in a situation like that, because there's so many things that you have to reconsider. First of all, the person might now appear to you as a threat. That's pretty immediate. So there's a biological, physiological response first. Your body reacts first. Then you respond emotionally. That's going to take a while, and you know that emotional response might extend over days or weeks or months or even years. And then as you're doing that as well, you're going to try to start to resort out your interpretive schema so that it can adjust to the transformation that this error on your part, say, or this catastrophe or this betrayal, it has to adjust to whatever information that event contains. And so the orienting reflex can manifest itself over an extraordinarily long period of time. It's best to think about it as the initial part of what can be a very complex learning process. Now, that was a standard idea in psychology for the longest period of time, that we created a detailed internal model of the world, and we watched how the world was unfolding. We compared the two, and the physiology, the neurophysiology of this was even understood to some degree even by the Russians in the early 1960s, because they basically localized, you could use complex EEG, electroencephalogram technology, to localize where the orienting reflex was occurring in the brain, and basically it appeared to occur, roughly speaking, in the hippocampus. And the theory arose that your brain, your cortex, let's say, produced a very complex model of the world, an internal model, and your senses were producing a model of the external world, and the hippocampus was watching those two things to see if they matched. And if they didn't match, there was a mismatch signal, and that would be the orienting reflex, and then your body would start to prepare itself for whatever that mismatch meant, and then you would engage in exploratory behavior to try to update your model. That was the standard theory, and it was very well accepted theory. It has elements of cybernetic theory in it, but it was well accepted enough so that when people first started to experiment with artificial intelligence, that's how they tried to make artificially intelligent systems. They tried to make ones that would model the world and then act and then compare the changes in the world to that model. But that didn't go anywhere, as it turned out, because it turned out that it's so difficult to see and model the world that people had no idea how complex that was. It was impossibly complex, as it turned out. And so that's part of the reason we don't have robots wandering around doing apparently simple things like walking in an environment like this. Now, when we look at the environment, we think, well, it's not that hard to look at. It's full of objects, and they're just self-evident. There they are, and we can just wander through it, and we don't even do that consciously to any great degree, because so much of that perception is presented to our consciousness without effort in some sense. But the AI guys learned pretty quick that perceiving the world was way more difficult than anybody had guessed. And then this experiment really, in some sense, put a phenomenological punch behind that observation, because one of the presuppositions of the orienting reflex theory that I just laid out was that you were very good at detecting changes, that your nervous system would automatically detect change, anomaly, right? Any mismatch between your model and what you expected. And then, well, the AI guys, I think, figured out, first of all, that was a big problem, that the problem of perception was much more complicated than that. It's out of that same set of observations, in some sense, that postmodernism emerged in literature, in literary criticism, because, well, it turns out to be hard enough to see a normal object like a chair, and part of that is if you just do that to the chair, it's really different than it was before. You could imagine how different it would be if you tried to paint the chair under both those conditions, right? And if you really got good at looking at it, you'd find that even though if I asked you what color this is, you'd say white, if you were actually painting it, you'd find out that the colors of the chair when it's in that location and the colors in the chair when it's in that location, just because of the difference in lighting, are substantially different. I think it was Monet, who painted a very large series of haystacks in the French countryside, right, in different seasons and under different conditions of illumination, just because he was exploring how radically different the same object could be as it moved through contexts. And so it isn't even obvious why we think this is the same object when you move it. And the answer is something like, well, you can sit on it in both positions, which is not a description of an object, by the way, right? That's a description of something that's useful, something that's a tool, something that exists in relationship to your body. It's not an object. And so if you think that just looking at something like a chair is almost impossibly difficult and subject to interpretation, then imagine how difficult it is to perceive something like a text, like a novel. because a novel obviously is subject to multiple interpretations, and the interpretations are going to depend on, well, at least in principle, on the intent, conscious and unconscious, of the author, of the time, of the place, of the culture, of the language. Then that's just on the side of the production itself, but then there's the reader. It's like, I've read books when I was 16 and then reread them, say, when I was 40, and the book was almost completely different as far as I was concerned, partly because I knew what was in it the second time and I didn't know what was in it the first time. And so the meaning that manifests itself out of a book is a consequence of all the complexity of the book plus all the complexity of the reader. And so, you know, if you're reading Russian literature, for example, and you've already read 50 Russian novels, you're going to be in a much more you're going to be in a different interpretive space than you are if, say, the Russian novel is the first novel you've ever read. And the postmodernists were grappling with this, as well as with many other ideas that I think contaminated their thinking. And their conclusion was, well, you can't extract out a canonical meaning from a text. It's so dependent on the situation that to say the text has a interpretable meaning is actually an error.